With that, what I'm going to do is go ahead and introduce now Martin Gallivan. Ed and I have had the privilege of knowing Martin Gallivan and his co-conspirator in crime, Jessica Jenkins, who come and they do archaeological digs at our property here. Martin Gallivan is a professor of anthropology at the College of William and Mary, where he has conducted archaeological research in the Chesapeake region for more than 25 years. His work focuses on Native American culture and history, great for Indigenous Peoples Month that kicks off next month, I believe, and with an emphasis on Algonquin speaking communities, the stewardship of coastal landscapes before the European colonization. His current research examines human-environment interactions at the woodland period sites along the lower York River. So please welcome Martin Gallivan.
Great. Thanks, Robert. Thanks for being here on this beautiful afternoon. Let me get situated here. I've got about 20 slides here, which I'll run through with some text on it. Sometimes it's not good to have too much text on the slide, but if at any point you can't hear me or you have a question, just raise your hand. I'm used to that. My students interrupt me all the time, more than I'd like sometimes. But let me see if I can. Okay, good. That's going to work. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about for the next 40 minutes or so is the relationship between the Algonquian people of the lower York River and the fisheries and forests here. This is where I assume most of you live, maybe all of you live. So you know this area well. We're going to talk about the ways in which Native communities before the colonial era, so we're talking before 1607, the way they managed the forest and fishery. And that's an idea that my, what did you call her? My co-conspirator? My co-conspirator, Jesse Jenkins, and I have developed over the years. So that's what I want to unpack for you today, but let me just start by talking about partnerships. Philip and Ann have been fantastic, as well as John Aldrich here, am I right? Hosting us as we've come and visited for two seasons now, and a number of other visits outside of that to do work on their land. And we've learned a lot of the ideas that we've got, most of the ideas that we're developing here come from that work, and so that's been really instrumental. We also have partnerships with the local Native American communities. We are advised by an Indigenous advisory board to our project, which consists of, we've invited all the Native tribes of Virginia, the state and federally recognized tribes, to come and give us advice on the research questions we ask, the kinds of approaches we take, how we do the work, how we represent the work, and that's been a really positive partnership with those communities. I'm seeing there's a few Fairfield Foundation people out there. They have been really instrumental in introducing us to the pages and helping us think through the work we've done in Gloucester County. So they're another important partner. I've got a list here because I didn't want to forget. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources has funded some of our work, and they've been really helpful. The Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, just down the road, has been great. Whenever we need a boat to get out on the river, we call our friends at VIMS, but they also have extraordinary expertise on marine science, the science of oysters, for example. We have worked very closely with the U.S. Navy, sometimes on the other side of the river, and there have been lots of students at William and Mary. My research partner, Jesse, formerly taught at Flagler College, which is a small college in Florida, but in part because of the interesting work that we've been doing here, another bigger college, Clemson University, has just hired her, so she's in her first semester there. So we've benefited a lot from the support of those institutions, William and Mary, Flagler, and Clemson. And if I've forgotten anybody, I apologize, but I did want to mention that. So what I'm talking about here, can you folks actually see that in the back? It's a bright room here. Hopefully my font is big enough. If not, just let me know. We're talking about the area you know well. We're talking about the lower York River, the tidal estuarine portion of the York, which is of course an extraordinarily rich place to live today, and was so for hundreds of years before the colonial era as well. We've got the meeting of salt water from the ocean pushed up through the tides through the Chesapeake Bay. We've got the fresh water flowing down from West Point and other areas to the west, creating this estuarine setting where oysters are growing, where there are crabs, where there are lots of other fish runs, think of shad. Of course, there are rich forests along the banks of these rivers as well, where there's an incredible array of wild resources, even before the native communities begin farming corn, beans, and squash. But there are some threats to these areas today. So I just pulled up this is a State of the York River Watershed report that I just read this morning to try to be organized for this conversation today. But that report suggests that about 95% of the York River shoreline has eroded really over the last 60 or 70 years. There's been substantial tidal marsh loss, which is an important part of the ecosystem, of course. There's accelerating development pressure, which I'm sure you folks are familiar with. And there's also erosion of archaeological sites, many of which are right on the shoreline. I don't know if you can see, those are my hands in the middle of the winter there. I was working with Thane, who's to my right here on a site on Prop Tank Creek, which is eroding into the York River, and it's not the only one. So there are some real threats today to that river ecosystem. But what I want to focus on is I want to sort of rewind the clock way back in time, at least 1400, really more years than that. But I want to talk about 1400 years of stewardship of the fishery and forest along the lower York. And here I'm focused on the pre-colonial history of that area. So the question that I want to start with today is, how did indigenous communities sustain life and fisheries along the York River for over a millennium? Now, where does that question come from? I've been excavating sites along the York River for many decades now, and one of the most prominent things we bump into are what are called middens, M-I-D-D-E-N. So not a mitten, but a midden, which is a big pile of shell and other artifacts, pottery, stone tools, the bits of charcoal from fires, and other aspects of, glad I didn't take the lid off that, other aspects of native life in the area. So in excavating these middens, we see layers and layers of oyster shells, also clams as well, but it's primarily oysters. And we can actually use those middens to tell time. The deepest deposits are the oldest, the ones at the top are the most recent. And as we look at the oyster shells from the different layers of those middens, those trash piles along the York, we can see a complicated history of native communities fishing the oysters, of managing the forests, and we can see that the oyster shells, they change over time in terms of the numbers of shells, the size of the shells, and that gives us a rough sense of the health of the oyster fishery. So there's a moment in time when the native communities, and I'll unpack this in a minute, began settling year-round in large village communities right along the York River and the creeks flowing into it. And at that point in time, they began to harvest the oyster fishery very intensively. And we can see in those midden deposits that the oysters initially become a little bit smaller and a little bit less frequent, suggesting to us that there's some real pressure on the oyster fishery. In other words, the native communities are actually overfishing the capacity of the fishery to recover from that pressure. So that's not unusual. We see that in other places around the world when people settled down and began to focus on a resource. But what's really interesting is over the next 1400 years, oysters get bigger and they get more plentiful, which is not what you'd expect. Oftentimes people overharvest and put a lot of pressure on a resource, and that did happen initially here, but we've got some indications that the native communities are adjusting their practices and managing that resource so it's actually more productive and sustainable over the long run. And we're basing that mostly on the numbers and the size of those oysters in those midden deposits. So the question we have is, how did they do that, right? And the answer that we'll come up with is through fairly subtle ways of managing the resource. Today we have lots of environmental organizations that are working to help sustain the oyster fishery and other fisheries. And some of those same practices we can see preliminary indications of parallels in the archaeological record. So we'll talk about those in a minute. And the key answer that I want to sort of get to in this is that it's not necessarily about any particular technology or any particular knowledge of the environment, but it's about cooperation, about groups of people working together collaboratively to engage in collective action to do things that allow that fishery to recover and become healthy over time. So I'm going to refer to the York River as a commons, right? So as a professor, I feel like I've got to define my terms. What is a commons, right? So a commons is simply a shared resource, right? So the air we breathe is a commons, or the forests that exist today are commons, right? And there's sort of a famous paper that was published in 1968 by an economist named Garrett Hardin called The Tragedy of the Commons. Anybody ever heard of the tragedy of the commons? Just trying to gauge my audience here. Okay. So it was a really interesting argument that Hardin came up with. He was focused on the ways in which commons, whether they be a forest or a fishery or a watershed, the way they tended to degrade over time. And he made the argument that individuals acting according to their own self-interest to get as much as they can out of that commons, whether it be a bunch of grass outside the Gloucester County Courthouse or a forest in the woods or the fishery, they will maximize their returns on using that resource so that eventually over time it degrades. And the tragedy of the commons is that everybody loses in the end, right? Because even though for a short time you're making intensive use of that resource, its degradation means you can't over the long run, and everybody loses out because you don't have access to that rich resource, right? So the interesting thing is that oftentimes this doesn't happen, right? It sometimes happens, but doesn't always happen. And there was an economist. She won the Nobel Prize in 1990 for this work. Her name is Elinor Ostrom. She figured out in studying, reading a lot of history, talking to archaeologists, talking to anthropologists, looking at a number of studies, that as often as not, local communities organize themselves in a way to manage resources collectively and responsibly, because they know it's in their best interest to do so, right? And so she came up with a set of principles for how this works. Oftentimes this is a bottom-up sort of organization, right? And it does involve collective action, cooperation between communities to manage those resources. So I want to make the argument here that what we have is a 1,400-year example of that sort of process with the native communities in the lower York River managing this oyster fishery. And I think they're actually doing it to the forest as well, but that's research we're just beginning to do. And the key group that's cooperating is what we've termed the Creekside Village. Creekside Village, hard to say that word. So essentially, it's tough to see that little model there because it's a bit washed out, but we've got archaeological evidence of native communities settling along the lower embayed portions of creeks. What do I mean by that? So where different creeks flow into the York and they're tidal, they tend to be wide, right? A number of you probably, the Pages, live along the lower embayed portion of a creek, and a number of you probably live near or on those sorts of bodies of water. So from the best we can tell from our research, native communities weren't all concentrated in one spot, but they were dispersed around the edges of that lower embayed portion of the creek. And of course, that area in the creek is a great place for oysters to grow, for oyster reefs to thrive, right? So we think that the Creekside Village was the cooperating unit, or the institution, to use academic speak, that's cooperating to manage the fishery in a responsible way. So we see evidence of this in terms of large middens, big piles of oyster shells right at the mouth of the creeks, and then evidence of houses that are on the bluffs overlooking creeks. They're not all concentrated in one spot, but they're dispersed around these locations. And we think that that settlement form essentially allowed people to develop their own collective identity and to work cooperatively to manage the fishery in a responsible way. And I'm going to try to unpack how that happens in a minute, but first let's get to when that happens, right? So I suspect that there is collective action by native communities for many hundreds and hundreds of years before what we've termed the Oyster Revolution, but we can see a real change in the archaeological record around AD 200 or 200 CE. So about 1,800 years ago, we see the creation of these creekside villages, and the ways these middens are forming look a bit different after AD 200 than they did before AD 200. So we think this is the beginnings of that collective action around the oyster fishery. So this is the same time where we see a new ceramic tradition come in. It's called the Mockley phase. That's what archaeologists refer to it as. Pottery is tempered with crushed oyster shell. And that is a way that pots are made throughout the lower York River, but not just the lower York River, throughout all of Tidewater, Virginia, all of coastal Maryland, all the way up almost to the Delaware Bay. And that's new. That shared ceramic tradition across hundreds and hundreds of miles in several different river valleys is a new thing. Didn't exist before AD 200. So not only are people working collaboratively in their own communities after this time, but they have social networks with people far afield. And we know that because they're sharing the same tradition of making this shell-tempered pottery, which is actually kind of hard to do. I've tried to do it and failed a number of times. If you don't know how to do it right, a shell-tempered pot is really hard and really durable and does a great job for you, but it often explodes, at least in my experience, explodes in the production process. So begin to think about this landscape as not just the creekside village along the York, but also a network of interconnected people sharing the same material traditions, the same settlement form. They're trading with one another, probably marrying one another, and traveling between each other's communities on dugout canoes along the rivers, because of course those are the main transportation highways of the time. So just to jump to the early 17th century and a bit of the historical geography of the York River at that point, we begin to see, it's hard for you to see, but we've got a couple of famous maps. The Robert Tyndall map at the top, which I just traced and reproduced there to make it a little bit more legible. And then the John Smith map of Virginia. Who's seen the John Smith map of Virginia? So the John Smith map of Virginia is a really remarkable resource for historians and archaeologists like myself. It's John Smith's depiction of not just the York River, but all of coastal Virginia. And it really depicts a native landscape, because in 1607, of course, it was a native landscape. The map includes two different kinds of native communities. There are what he calls king's houses, and he has this little icon of a house. And then he has what are called ordinary houses, and he has a little circle as the icon for those communities. And so archaeologists and historians have looked at that and said, what we're seeing here is the depiction of a political landscape, a landscape where not everybody has the same status. Not every community is as influential as every other one. So in the lower York River, there's a king's house that's called Kiskiak. And there's also, right across the river, there's an ordinary house called Kattenkack. And I'm not sure whether the original Algonquian pronunciation is that. That's as close as we can get. But looking at this map, we can see that there are different kinds of communities all living along the river. From the best we can tell, the Pages live at Kattenkack. That is that ordinary house that's across from Kiskiak. The settlement of Kiskiak is on the Naval Weapons Station, Yorktown. And as I mentioned, the Navy's been very supportive of archaeological research there. So we can begin to understand how this place was organized by looking at the 17th century and working our way back, and we can actually see on that map a representation of these creek-based communities, these creekside dispersed village communities. We can see those on John Smith's map of Virginia. Many of the villages are located along these little U-shaped lower embayed portions of creeks. So we know that the archaeological record matches up rather well with the map record. So our idea that these communities are managing the forests and the fisheries is based on some evidence. And this is really a hypothesis we have. We're not 100% sure exactly what the archaeological record says, but the evidence is pointing in the direction that there's intentional management of the commons in the lower York. So the kinds of evidence that we're looking at for the oyster fishery, I'm going to just cheat off my notes here so I don't have to turn around. The kinds of evidence that we see in the oyster fishery include evidence of selective harvesting of near-shore juvenile oysters. All right, there's a lot of jargon there. What does that mean? So rather than harvesting the deep water oysters that are in the reefs offshore, the native communities, for the most part, are focusing on oysters that are growing near shore. They tend to be smaller. They're oysters that don't necessarily last many years. They're what marine scientists call a sink population, like sink like you wash your hands, right? So these are populations that don't reproduce themselves, whereas the offshore reefs that had typically had bigger oysters that look a little different, those are called source populations. They reproduce spat baby oysters that allow the fishery to be reproduced and to be sustained. So the native communities are focusing primarily on those nearshore smaller oysters for consumption. And we see evidence that they're perfectly capable of harvesting the offshore oysters. They're not that hard to go after. If you have the dugout canoe, you can go get them. And they did so on occasion, usually for special events. We have some evidence from the Kiskiak site that they're harvesting these offshore oysters, which are bigger, maybe tastier, for feasts that are close to where the chief was residing at Kiskiak. So again, we know they're capable of harvesting those deep shore oysters, but they're focused on the nearshore oysters. We also see evidence they're only harvesting oysters during certain times of year. Now we know everybody grew up and learned that you only eat oysters in months with R in them, right? And they're following those rules, but they're actually restricting it even tighter to the winter months when they're harvesting and eating large numbers of oysters. So that seasonal restriction of harvest allows the fishery to reproduce more readily. We also see some hints in the archaeological record that creekside village, the folks living in the lower embayed portion of Indian Field Creek or any number of creeks flowing into the York, that those folks are cooperating with one another and working collaboratively to harvest the fishery right in front of their settlement. And that kind of makes sense. You know, they can simply walk down to the water and engage in those practices. And there's one thing I just added this morning. There's some indications that along some creeks, like Felgates Creek, which is on the other side of the York, there's intentional deposition of what's called substrate, and I'll define my terms here. So there are these ancient fossils. You folks know about the Yorktown Formation, Stave fossil, the big, beautiful Chesapeake Jeffersonius, this big scallop. Well, we see some indications that the native communities are intentionally adding those fossils, and not just the Stave fossil, but the sort of conglomerated bits of the Yorktown Formation that are in the cliffs going down to the water, that are intentionally adding them to the water because they form a good surface for baby oysters to land on and to grow on. So that's what's called substrate. So we see some indications that is being done. Again, all putting that together, they're fairly subtle methods of managing the fishery, not super complicated, doesn't require high tech, but over time, we believe that's what led to the rebound of the fishery after it initially declined. Now this is work that we're doing that's fairly new. We also see some indications that native communities are harvesting or managing the forest in a very intentional way too. And this is not surprising. Native communities throughout eastern North America engage in what's called cultural burning or anthropogenic fire to create a mix of different forests at different stages of maturation. So it's sometimes called a mosaic. So when you do that, when you have an area small area that's burned, an area that's more mature next to it, you create these edges, right? Where the sunlight can reach the edge of that forest. And in these edges, you get hazelnuts, you get pawpaw trees, you get berries, you get lots of these wild foods that are edible or comestibles that grow really well in these edge environments. And throughout eastern North America, native communities, both before and after they begin engaging in agriculture, are doing this on a regular basis. So it's not surprising that we see some evidence of that in actually the pollen cores of sites in the lower York River. There's evidence that after AD 200, there's a lot more charcoal in those pollen cores, especially right next to the village communities. So our hypothesis is that this is another form of managing a resource, managing a commons, but in this case, not in the water, on the land. Let me pick up the pace here. We all got to get to it, the exhibit and the reception, right? So how does this happen? So once again, we suspect that it's these communities of shell-tempered pottery-making folks in the Immokalee phase living in these dispersed creekside villages that are working collaboratively to manage the fishery and manage the forest. And why do they do so? To create a sustainable future for their families and for future members of their community. And we think that there's clear evidence that it's that creekside village that is the center point of that. So just to work forward in time, I've mentioned AD 200. Beginning around AD 900, there's a real shift in the way these native communities are engaging with the resource. They begin farming, right? And when they do so, raising corn, beans, and squash, obviously that's a big change in how they're organizing themselves, feeding themselves, settling in communities. But even with that shift, we see evidence in the midden deposits that the same practices of managing the fishery, managing the forest are continuing, passed down through multiple generations of what's sometimes called traditional ecological knowledge. And again, our evidence for that are these different layers of middens that are like chapters of a book. We do see evidence of corn, bits of charred corn kernels sometimes in those midden deposits. And we actually initially thought, oh, everything's going to change once they became farmers. It didn't, actually. They did farm, but that was an added resource that was used to supplement the already existing wild resources. Think of the oysters, think of the pawpaws, think of the berries, those nuts that you can gather in those edge environments. So that those practices of managing the commons continued even after they began farming. And then at the end of the pre-colonial sequence, we have indications that Kiskiak became this political center. It became a part of the Powhatan chiefdom, a chiefdom within a larger chiefdom. So it's a moderately sized chiefdom on the other side of the York River that probably had influence over the entire lower York. And that gets folded into the broader Powhatan chiefdom, which is centered, of course, at Werowocomoco, right, also in Gloucester County. So we suspected, once we get a chief on the scene, everything's going to change, that all these management practices are going to shift. That's not what happens, at least according to the evidence that we see. In fact, there's continuity in management practices that even crossed over into the era of a chiefdom existing in the lower York River. So we've got the introduction of a hierarchical polity, or a chief who has some kind of influence politically over other communities, other people in the area, and yet they're continuing to engage in some of the same sustainable practices of managing the commons after probably around 1300 to 1400 is about when we see evidence that there's a palisaded or fenced-in compound at Kiskiak that we think is evidence that there's a chief on the scene at that point. So we've got the Powhatan chiefdom in place, different kinds of authority. There are chiefs. The term in Algonquin is werowance for the chief that would have lived at Kiskiak. His name is Atohatin in the early 1600s. The Jamestown colonists interacted with him, they met him. The Kiskiaks weren't very friendly to the Jamestown colonists, so the Jamestown colonists didn't stay long in that village, but they did write about those interactions. And power and authority in the Powhatan world was complicated, right? There were these chiefs. There's a chief of the chiefs. There's Powhatan, who is sometimes referred to as the paramount chief. But there's other forms of authority in the Powhatan world too. Religious figures, priests, also wield an extraordinary amount of authority and actually advised the chiefs on what they could and couldn't do. So we've got this centralized form of political authority in the Powhatan world, and a lot of people study that. It's really fascinating history. We can learn a lot about that by reading the Jamestown accounts. But once again, we see evidence that these management practices, managing the forest and the fishery, continues in much the same way. There's some small adjustments because the population is larger, but the same kinds of evidence from the oyster fishery and the forest continued through that change. And again, we didn't expect that when we started. We expected, there's going to be a shift. There'll be werewants or a chief who's now directing who can get access to what resource. And the evidence from the oyster middens is going to be different once we get that political authority centralized within Kiskiak. We also thought, oh, things will look different at Kiskiak, which is on the Naval Weapons Station, from Kattenkak, that's the page's place. An ordinary house would have different kinds of practices than the centralized village. And in some ways they do. In the centralized village, there's more evidence of large-scale gatherings and feasting, huge numbers of oysters being consumed with other food. But the management practices were maintained much the same way, again, across this 1,400 years period. So the 1,400 years is 8,200 all the way up through 1,600. So let me try to bring this home. Of course, the story changes in a big way with the early colonial era. We get different kinds of harvesting of the oyster fishery after the introduction of colonists, and then in the early American period, use of technology like oyster dredges, eventually motorized boats, and the oyster fishery comes under extreme pressure by the overharvesting in the 19th century, and more or less collapses in the 19th and early 20th century. So that's a story in which the lessons from the pre-colonial era were not learned, and there wasn't the kind of careful, collaborative, sustainable management of the fishery in the colonial period. But things look a little better in more recent times, where we've got evidence of collaborative management. Think of the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, the governments of Maryland and Virginia. Of course, the Chesapeake extends on up into Maryland, and engaged in careful practices to try to manage the oyster fishery and to make it sustainable. And things have begun to turn around. Some of you, I know I was talking to the person sitting next to me, has a little oyster reef and oyster bags in front of her house. Oyster farming, of course, is a big deal in the York River, also on the Rappahannock, and to some extent on the James. So the oyster harvests have turned around and are much more productive than they were in the past. In fact, this has become a very lucrative resource for Virginia because we've figured out how to farm oysters with what are called triploid oysters that you can eat 12 months out of the year, right? And that grow more quickly to a mature size. And there's also protection of areas that are refuge areas that are protected for reproducing spawn. So I just stole that number from the State of the York River report this morning. 287 pounds per year of oyster harvest in recent years. And I think that report goes on up through 2023. So fairly recent, and the report does call for shared stewardship of the resource, which sounds familiar given what the Native communities did for centuries before the colonial era. So I'll close and answer any questions you might have, or try to answer them anyway, by giving you a quick sense of where we're pointing this research going forward. We've spent a lot of time, students in my lab measured lots and lots of oyster shells, so we know a lot about oysters. We're interested in continuing that work, and the excavations we've done on Ann and Philip's yard and at John Aldrich's place have really helped us figure that out. We're also interested in really understanding how Native communities used fire, how they intentionally set small-scale fires that were very carefully controlled to make the forest more productive than it would be even if there were no people here, right? And I've talked about the creation of those forest mosaics and those edge environments where we get plants you can eat, comestibles, that wouldn't be there, wouldn't be as productive without that intentional management of the forest. So we're going to continue to look at our oyster shells. We're going to do some sedimentary coring to try to figure out what sorts of plants are growing and how this fire management regime was put in place and how it changed over time. There's a picture of some remote sensing equipment in the center there, which we used at Philip and Ann's place to try to see underneath the ground so we can be very respectful of the archaeological record and efficient with our time, and because we'll have a better sense of where to dig. That's a technology that we've incorporated more and more, and it's probably a good time for my clicker to give out, right? 'Cause I'm at the end of, that's all right, the show goes on. So that's where we're headed looking forward. And once again, just to sort of reiterate what I've said here, we're seeing evidence that across many hundreds and hundreds of years, Native communities developed a set of practices and principles and values so that they could engage with the oyster fishery and the forests, and probably other forms of the commons as well, but we focus on those two things, in ways that made them more productive than they would have been otherwise, made them sustainable through management practices. We often hear today about environmental disaster stories, climate change, and there are some really scary things happening, right? But I think it's also useful to remind ourselves that when people work collaboratively, collectively, and intelligently, we can engage with the environment, with commons, in a way that is smart and sustainable and actually leads to good things in the end. So I think I'll leave off there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes?
You said something in the beginning
I'm just
about
going to stand over here. I feel like I'm in court here standing up. That's right.
the different sizes of the oysters that you found across time, and I just wanted to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we measure oysters from the hinge to the end, so we need the whole oyster, not just a fragmented one. And we measure other things too, but that's really the most telling measurement. And most of the oysters we find in middens are actually fairly small. They're not that big, which surprised us, right? Because you think today you go to a restaurant and get these nice big, tasty oysters. And we also saw evidence in these midden deposits that not only were the oysters fairly small, but they actually got smaller and fewer at one point at the bottom of our middens, right around AD 200. And so, not exactly sure what that means, but if you put it in the context of what comes next, it seems to point to an over-harvest of the oysters, so that they're harvesting more and more young oysters. They're not letting them grow to a mature length, and there's fewer and fewer of them as a result. So that's the smaller and fewer of them signal that we're picking up. And oftentimes, there's a story of environmental degradation, which, well, that just continues until the resource goes extinct. Well, obviously oysters aren't extinct. And in the pre-colonial era, they got bigger and more abundant. So we thought when we figured that out, we realized, oh, there's an interesting story here. And the truth is, the story that we're telling in the Chesapeake is not that unusual. If you look at native shell middens all down the Atlantic coast to the Gulf Coast, actually, there's similar evidence of sustainable practices, where there hasn't been a ton of research to the north in New England, but I suspect you'd find the same thing there. That was a very lengthy answer. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, so it sounds like maybe that was when they were realizing that they were using up the resource.
That's what we're guessing.
Because I kind of wondered how did they know? How did they know that there was a problem? How did they know to burn the forest?
Right.
Those kind of
So those are excellent questions that archaeologists are not well positioned to answer. We can make some informed guesses based on what we see. And what I suspect, and this is my informed guess, that they did recognize, there's fewer oysters. They're smaller. This is not good. We need to do something about this and organize ourselves. And if you look at the practices they do, they're not that complicated. It doesn't take a genius to figure this stuff out. They're very knowledgeable about the marine science, as I'm guessing a lot of you are because you live on the river. So putting that knowledge to work and doing it in a collaborative way, say, hey, let's be smart about this, neighbor, and harvest only the nearshore oysters and let the ones offshore reproduce. I suspect that was something that was done intentionally, but I can't really prove it.
I was going to say something about, you mentioned going extinct. We came within a hair of going extinct.
Right.
For the
For
eastern oyster in the 90s. This disease called dermo changed and it got really bad starting around 1985, and we're lucky we didn't lose them all before 2000.
Yeah, and there's another disease too that's not quite as bad. I can't remember.
MSX.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So this is, we could have gone differently, right? Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
How many species of oysters that there is in a river?
So there's only one species of oysters in the east. There's a different species of oysters on the west coast of the United States. What is the scientific, somebody help me out with the scientific name? Crustaceae virginica, thank you. Yeah, so they're all Crustaceae, I have a hard time saying that word. They're all that species in Virginia and on the East Coast. But there are other shellfish. We do have clams. There are, of course, freshwater mussels if you go up into the freshwater portion. There's other shellfish that native communities are making use of. Yeah, in the back there.
How long have people been eating oysters?
Yeah, good question. So in Virginia, of course, we go way back. We've got the Ice Age, the Pleistocene, which ends around 10,000 years ago. And there's no Chesapeake Bay then, right? So there isn't an estuary where the freshwater meets the saltwater for them to eat the oysters. The Chesapeake Bay forms around 3000 BC, so that'd be about 5,000 years ago. Although there's sort of early versions of it as the tides begin to capture the lower rivers like the James and the York, and then eventually capture the lower portion of the Susquehanna River, forming this gigantic bay. But as soon as that happens, we do see oysters on archaeological sites. It seems like they're eating them right away, but they're not eating them in the huge numbers to create these big midden piles, at least in the lower York, until around AD 200. So that's not when they first started eating them, but that's when they first started getting really serious about eating them.
Is that, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did they eat clams also and crabs?
They must have. We don't find crab claws or anything in the middens, and I think it's just because they don't survive well in
But
the
you
ground.
find clam shells.
We do find lots of clam shells. Yeah, in some places it's close to 50-50. I've focused on the oysters because they're a little more common, but we can certainly do this kind of study on clams.
This 200 AD comes up a lot, and so I'm a little curious about whether the Algonquin speakers moved in at that time.
Yeah, there's
Or if they were already here and they changed the way they...
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty about that, but you're asking the right question. So some folks see the creation of this new ceramic tradition that is across a big, broad area of the Chesapeake as evidence of Algonquian speakers. So Algonquian is a language family, right? So there are Algonquian speakers all up and down the Atlantic coast. There's other Algonquian speakers in the Great Lakes region. So there's a long-term migration from the Great Lakes into the Canadian Maritimes, so think of like Nova Scotia, working your way down the New England coast into the Middle Atlantic coast, Delaware Bay, Chesapeake Bay. They get as far south as the North Carolina Outer Banks. So that's a historical process that must have happened. There's a lot of disagreement on when it happened, or what it looks like in the archaeological record. Some archaeologists think that shell-tempered pottery is the marker of the first Algonquins in the area. That might be right. I suspect something else happened, actually. I think that people living here, Algonquin speakers, non-Algonquin speakers, invented that technology here in the Chesapeake. In fact, I think it's in the lower Chesapeake, near, what's Portsmouth, the Norfolk, that area. So the southern Chesapeake is where the earliest shell-tempered pottery is. And I think it moves north as people are building social networks and doing this oyster revolution, as I've termed it. So what's the story on Algonquian arrival in the region? When did it happen? I'm not 100% sure. Some people say it happens a little bit earlier than AD 200. Some people say 200. Some people say right at Farming, AD 900. And it's tricky to tell. So I'm not exactly sure. Yes, sir.
Is it known how the natives fished the oyster reefs that were in deep water? I mean, they didn't have tongs like
Right.
in the boats.
Yeah, that's a good question. I know they did it because we see oysters that look like deep water oysters. And oysters, of course, have different sizes and shapes depending on where they grow, right? So the deep water oysters, they tend to be longer, more deeply cupped, and they tend to have lots of parasite holes on the sponge parasitism, these little sponges that bore holes in them, right? The little holes that you see. As opposed to the ones in the nearshore which don't have those because those sponges don't live well when they're exposed at low tide, so they don't tend to have little holes in them. So there is one reference in the colonial accounts of when a colonist arrives in a village, the chief says to the boys, get in the canoe, go out, get some oysters, and get the good ones. He doesn't exactly use that language, but I'm paraphrasing it. And so, and they didn't, I wish they wrote exactly how they did it. But you know, some of these offshore reefs, they're not far below the surface. It's not like you have to go 20 feet down to find them. They're pretty close to the surface. So you could paddle out, you could jump out of the canoe and just scoop them up. If you put your head in the water, it's not that hard to do. My guess is it's a fairly low-tech method. There is actually a picture from the North Carolina Outer Banks. Have you ever seen John White's, he has these famous watercolors of Indian life at these villages in the North Carolina Outer Banks. And these are Algonquian speakers, much like the folks here. And there is what looks to me like a man in a canoe with an oyster rake. Some people say, oh, that's a paddle. It's tough to tell. It looks to me like an oyster rake. And so they probably had some kind of simple wooden technology that doesn't last in the archaeological record to harvest offshore oysters. But that's probably the best answer I can give. Yeah.
Recently, there's some talk of the bay scallops and things. Do you find those also?
No, which surprised me. I saw that article in the paper that they've really come back, right? And you may know more about bay scallops than I know what I read in the Virginia Gazette a couple of days ago about this. What is the environment of a bay scallop? Do they need salty water, or can they grow in the sort of brackish water of Gloucester County? I don't know the answer. I'll have to look into that.
And then in the article seemed to indicate it was in eelgrass.
It indicated that they grew.
Eelgrass.
Right, right. It's a good question. Sorry, I don't know the answer to that one. Any other questions? In the back, yeah, go ahead.
I know you've been digging at these sites for many years, probably more than what I remember, but how early did you determine that oyster mittens could add to your knowledge?
Yeah, I first started digging an oyster midden, and I'll be brief here. Philip's hungry and wants to go to the exhibit, right?
I just thought things sounded being quiet, so I just...
So I first started digging a oyster midden in, what year was that? That would have been 2008, so that's a lot of years ago. And I dug a lot of different kinds of sites and was a very overconfident archaeologist. I knew what I was doing, right? Much younger man, less humble than I am now probably. And I knew that this midden was 2 meters deep, so 6 feet deep, and I said, oh, we can dig that. So I got out there with my William Mary students and we started digging it. We got only halfway done in a month. And so I had some graduate students help me for the next couple weeks, but then they had to go because they had to go do something else. So I dug the last 75 centimeters of this in the woods by myself with nobody else there. Probably not a really safe thing to do, right? This big hole in the ground. And just digging through those layers and realizing that the artifacts went back. You know, they actually went back even earlier than this AD 200 story that I was telling. I realized, oh, what we've got here is a record of long-term human-environmental relationships here. And we can tell a number of different stories by thinking very carefully how people are engaging the fishery, how they're engaging the estuary, what they're doing to the forest. Because the evidence of not just their artifacts, but the plant remains and the shellfish and other aspects of the environmental setting were embedded in that 2 meter deep deposit. So that's a longer answer than I planned. I guess that would have been 17 years ago is when I started to realize, oh, and my research pivoted. Before that, I had been working at the Wacomico site and doing what I think was really fascinating work there, focused on the politics and the landscape and the way the community was organized on the ground and how that conveyed the power of place. And that research, I think, I'm still super jazzed about that. And I can talk to you about that later on if you want. But I realized, oh, this is a different set of questions and a different set of concerns that I can pivot to. In the back, yeah.
So, one of those things. So, Polly Clifford, I live at Blundering Point on the York, across from the pages in John.
That's that thing that points right to the pages, right?
And it is a, eroding, but
right.
as per at the same time Lynn Ripley was walking the shoreline, I was.
Mhm.
So my finds are all on the shoreline as opposed to mostly onshore.
Right.
But one of the things, because I approached you before I had Randy Turner come out and showed him some things. But I also picked up Helen Roundtree's book, and speaking of freshwater infusion up at Purton, meaning the oysters weren't there.
They really weren't.
So in my mind, I have strong feelings about where Wacomico is, because Shelley was called that, not my name, it's a known fact, it's historical. But that if oysters would have been essential winter food, then saying it's here when the oysters are in the lower York. So I just, I have, just by living there and seeing the dynamics, and even the day I had Randy Turner on a December 1, there were whitecaps. So Queens Creek is right across from me, so Queens Creek, to Jamestown direct, but a dugout canoe would have turned broadside to the wind. So I just, in living there, the dynamics of things have opened my eyes and made me not have more questions, but I still stick to my theory, and I Thanes heard it, that it was in my backyard versus up at Purton.
Well, I will say this, there are lots of interesting things are happening in your backyard, at least to my way of thinking. And, the fairly modest number of oysters at Wacomico is some level a little surprising. I know we're well up the river, and oysters don't necessarily, but if you look at, there's a map of historic oyster reefs, and there are oyster reefs upriver of Wacomico. In fact, I showed a picture of a site on Prop Tank, right? Lots of oysters there.
They're
right?
raising them, they had them in like things, cages or something.
Yeah. So it's it's an interesting landscape, interesting question. But thanks for that. Anybody else? Well, thank you for the questions and the good conversation. Appreciate the invitation to be here.
Thank you.